which is, you noticed, often it's about being in nature, but it's also about family. It's not a, I think you don't want an idea to be a straitjacket.
Yeah.
It's not, it's kind of indirect argument, but it's not like a work with a thesis that
Yeah.
people have to come out with a single conclusion. That would be really reductive. But I knew that I wanted to explore from that perspective of abundance. So it was more collecting the work, and then it is true, ordering it within a chapbook is especially interesting because you can have groupings, but you typically, if you have only 25 pages, you probably won't have a lot of separate sections the way you would in a full length collection. No, so I tried to create an order that made sense to me. But then I know this is a long answer, but the actual ordering there, what is fascinating to me. So I submitted the manuscript, finishing line, accepted it. I think it had 24 poems in it, but then I had found a couple of others that I thought would work well. And so I asked if I could add 2 poems, and they said that was fine. So I had put them in, I had conceived of an order, and it was, I think the manuscript was due, but in May maybe, and then in April, a former student, a Berea grad, who is a brilliant writer, came back to Berea to visit. So he came over and we were talking about our work. And he said, "What are you working on?" I said, "Well, I'm finishing up this chapbook." And he said, "Oh, let me read through it." He's a novelist. So he picked up the group of poems. He went out there and sat quietly out on our deck and read through everything. And he came back in and he said, "I really like the collection." He said, "But I think you're missing in the ordering here. There's a narrative arc that could be created and you don't see it." So I said, "Okay, well, why don't you show me?" So he took the pages and reordered them, and some of his suggestions were really brilliant, I thought. And it was true, I was so close to my work and thinking in certain patterns about it that there were things that I was missing. So to give you one concrete example, I have a poem in there. I have one poem that involves each of them. I have 2 sons. My husband, I have 2 sons.
Okay.
So there's one poem that, for my first son turning, well, the 2 poems, Calling, and then for my first son turning 20, those are both about the birth, that's our first son. And then the poem called Blessings is a poem about my second son. Okay.
Okay.
Well, when I had created an order, I had them kind of in chronological order, right? So Callings, then for my first son, and then Blessings. And what this writer did was pull out the poem about my second son and move it up earlier, so it sort of stands on its own, and it didn't seem like the other way. He thought it seemed kind of like an afterthought.
Yeah.
One, then two. And that wasn't what I meant, but he thought that, and I think he liked the idea of having, Blessings in some ways is such a kind of comprehensive poem. He thought it worked better earlier in the collection like that. So there were a couple of other places where he had really good suggestions about the order.
And I think too that Blessings for my younger son coming earlier in the collection, also this one kind of sets up, I think, a lot of your aesthetic throughout your writing, because whenever I came here, your house looked exactly how I thought it would based on reading this.
Wow.
And you're talking about the Kentucky landscape, talking about the let's see, religious references, and then a strong focus on family. And I think that it kind of sets up both for the love and the hints of loss throughout the chapbook, like in the poem. Let me see if I can find it. On a dim morning in our family room. And I think that I would definitely agree, because this was one of the ones that pulled me in a lot, and it was
Mhm.
straight from the get-go. And then another,
Yeah, let me
okay,
add one
sorry.
comment on that. No, I mean, I think that is really wonderful for you to have noticed those things because Blessings was a later poem too.
Hmm.
It was written much more, more recently um, to the collection, whereas those other two had actually, I started drafting callings probably um, probably around 1996 or so, because of course that was a memory poem. And then, for my first son turning 20, that would have been also in 1996 because he was born in 76. It really was the year that he turned 20 and had gone off to college. He wasn't here, but so those were earlier poems that I then worked with a little bit. And then the other another one about him, his turning 18, which all of those were written in the 90s,
Hmm.
whereas Blessings had was written, well, my younger son was then, off at that point. So it was a more recent poem, and I think it is a little more global. Those other two were kind of very focused on that experience of birthing, mothering, although they widen out.
Hmm.
But yeah, and I think he picked that up, whereas I was mostly thinking about the family order,
Yeah.
So, and I think, right, separating that, having the one, about the 18th, the Tai Chi class, having that later on let it stand out more than it would have if it had been like if I had birth, 18, then 20, that
Hmm.
would have been a certain kind of narrative, but it wasn't the full story that I wanted the book to tell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and then I'm just wondering because of some of the language in for my first son, did he go into the army?
No, he was just away at school at
Okay.
that point, but I did. And what's interesting to me about that poem was that poem was driven by the first line. I mean, I had taken his brother, you see, who at that point would have been 16, so he was still here in high school.
Hmm.
I had taken him to school that morning, and it was his brother's birthday, but his brother is off in Massachusetts in college. We were going to talk to him later and all that, but it
Hmm.
wasn't like he was right there in the room. But I watched my younger son, walk into the building there, and then I thought about he's walking away from me, and I thought about my older son, and it was that really I didn't understand that you'd grow up. That was what came to me, and I remember pulling over to a different place in the parking lot and getting out a piece of paper and beginning to write, because what's powerful to me about that line was that it's about what I didn't understand, because that was what was powerful at that moment. Of course, everybody would say, duh, what did you think? But I hadn't viscerally understood what that was going to be. And if you hear that line, that's a line of iambic pentameter. And it just came to me. I did not understand that you'd grow up. See, it has
Okay.
5 beats. That's a sonnet line. And that poem is what's called a blank verse sonnet, which means it doesn't have in rhyme, but it does have lines of pentameter,
Okay.
5 beats in a line. And a pentameter line it's the voice of speech. Um, and it's a lovely length because it's long enough to do something, but it doesn't go on and on.
Yeah.
It's still kind of contained. And so what I was just flooded once that idea and rhythm came, what I hadn't understood, it was a combination of what he is now. Now this 20-year-old, was tall, muscled, he was a runner, a writer. I mean, all of these things. But then I had these images of him in the bath, when he was 1 year old. And so it was seeing the boy in the man and then juxtaposing those, turning on that negative that I didn't know these things would happen.
Hmm.
And then all the little pieces came, as you probably have noticed, my work tends to be autobiographical. I mean, I'm
Hmm.
writing out of my experience. So that moment when my mother died when our first son was 3.5. Um, but she adored him, and was so, and she knew that he was going to have a younger brother, so she had that sense of the shape of my life. But she really, really enjoyed our first son, and I remember it was a sort of casual comment, but they lived in Louisiana. We were standing in the kitchen in her home, and she came in, and I think Rafe was having a nap. She said, "I'm happy with my immortality."
Okay, yes.
And so that line, that spoke so much to me. Of course, at that time, we had no idea that she would be dead within a couple of years, but that is, children are a kind of immortality, and the chain keeps on. And of course, I didn't have a baby just to give my mother immortality, but I loved it that she said that. That made so that had stuck with me. And so then, of course, I'm happy with my immortality. It's a pentameter line, so it was like
Yeah.
the pieces came together. I did a little revising of that, but a lot of that poem really came in that first draft. And I think it was a combination of the rhythm of the words, the images, the kind of the vision from the poem, that it was the poem is really about what I didn't know, my not knowing, and the sudden realization of what there was.
And I think I think the form in this one, sometimes you run across a poem that like the form just speaks so strongly to the
Mhm.
meaning. And I think like the pentameter, where it's structured and how life is supposed to be
Mhm.
structured in a certain way. You have kids, they grow up, but that first line you didn't even know it was pentameter.
I
Even
didn't
though,
sit down and
yeah,
scan it, yeah,
exactly.
but there was
And
something about the rhythm of it that drew me. Also, it's really in quatrains. The Shakespearean sonnet. Sonnet is 14 lines. It's 4 4 4 2.
mhm.
So that is the way that poem works in terms of the structure. You see, I think
Yeah,
it's a sentence in each of the 4 lines, and then the couplet, uh, which somewhere the poem needs to
yeah.
turn, you see. And I kind of intuited all of that. I will say that I came late to writing poetry. In fact, I would have so laughed if I had been your age and somebody told me, you're going to love poetry and write poetry and be a poet, I would have laughed. I wanted to be, I wanted to write fiction
Mhm.
because I didn't know any poets. I mean, I read only childhood poetry. I mean, it just didn't really. I think I always loved the music and language, but I just was never drawn particularly to poetry. Um, but uh, but I think coming to it, when I did come to it, I had a lot of study of poetry under my belt at that point because my graduate work in English and my teaching, and I had read a lot of poems from like Shakespeare's
Mhm.
time on up. I mean, like 1600 to the present is kind of the literature, British and American, is literature that I know and have taught. So I had so much exposure to and study of poems of different types, all the way from epics like Milton's Paradise Lost to Shakespeare's and Donne's sonnets, and then a lot of 20th century writing, 19th century. Anyway, I had a lot of that.
Mhm.
And so I had, that's there in the background, the thing that manifests is, I mean, you